Whether you're a world-class athlete or a podcaster like me, we all understand the importance of mental and physical well-being and proper recovery for top-notch performance. That's why I'm excited that Unified Healing is sponsoring this podcast. Unified Healing is a new and super innovative global network of wellness centers powered by Energy Enhancement System, or EE System. If you haven't heard of the EE System, you'll want to listen up. This technology promotes wellness, deep relaxation, purification, and rejuvenation. In hundreds of locations across the globe, access to a center is easy and affordable. Interested in experiencing the EE System technology for yourself? Go to unifiedhealing.com/bluewire to learn more and find a center near you. That's unifydhealing.com/bluewire. No material or testimonials on the Unified Healing website are intended to be viewed as medical advice or a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or treatment and before undertaking a new healthcare regimen, including EE System.
And you mentioned what happens in sort of the closing minutes of the first half of this game, and it's absolutely insane.
It's November 2018, Chiefs at Rams. This is Remember That Game, the podcast about sporting events that take you on a journey and maybe tread the path of the zeitgeist. I'm your host, Thomas Emerick, and my guest is RotoViz co-owner Shawn Siegele. We last got together on the show for the 0-3 Chiefs against Peyton Manning. Like that one, ton of points here, and both contained within the Chiefs' 25-year playoff losing streak. But Shawn, with two teams scoring at a historic pace, had things already started to feel different?
I think so. I think they had started to feel different really with the beginning of the Andy Reid era. And even the previous season there with Alex Smith. I mean, they scored so many points, and you have that week 17 game where they go ahead and play Patrick Mahomes with the backups, and he's unstoppable. And you're almost wondering, like, should we make the switch going into the playoffs that season? You get off to this 9-1 start that they come into the game with. And I mean, the number of points that they are scoring is absolutely insane. I think averaging 33 points a game coming into this one, where obviously as a result of some defensive touchdowns, that number jumps substantially. So many things happening in this game that we'll go through. Anytime that you have a young quarterback and there's still so much to prove, you know you're going to go through some ups and downs. But the other thing that just jumps out so glaringly right away is that you have peak skill position talent around Patrick Mahomes. You know, almost a quadruplets situation here where you have the young and explosive Tyreek Hill. You have peak Travis Kelce. And then you also have Kareem Hunt at his peak. And I mean, I've always been a little bit of a skeptic of Isaiah Pacheco. He had a good season last year. He'll probably have a good season this year. But I do think that there's something to be said for having that dynamic running back and what it does to also open up the offense for you. He didn't have any kind of crazy game in this one, but does score a longish receiving touchdown. This offense was absolutely unstoppable. The NFL has changed since, but such a fun watch.
Also, how fun was it to see the seeds planted for the eventual blossoming of the Jared Goff, the Josh Reynolds experience here tonight? The play-action dig undefeated in two different sets of uniforms. Though it was a nice sideline connection to put the Rams up 2 scores early. Cooper Kupp had just hit IR, but Brandon Cooks, Todd Gurley, and Robert Woods are all ripping off chunks. Were you buying into this Rams offense heading into the season after their breakout McVay debut in 2017?
I think so. And there are, I mean, quite a few similarities, but also quite a few differences between what we saw here with this Rams squad and the next step that they took in the 2018 season when you compare them with what we got from CJ Stroud and that young Houston Texans team a year ago. Similar to the situation with the Rams swapping out Sammy Watkins, who unfortunately his career had just really already been completely derailed by the foot injury, the injuries to his feet. Adding in a Brandon Cooks, who, I mean, Cooks is not a Stephon Diggs level player. He was pretty closely locked in that, more or less just over 1,000-yard type of season and type of contribution throughout this long early period of his career, outside of once he started to have these concussion problems. So not a superstar, but a well above average player, which then gives them the three guys. And that's one of the things that I think is interesting in terms of what they might be lacking for 2024, specifically looking at the Rams. One of the things that we look at in this game is the first game post Cooper Kupp injury. And so you go from 3 back down to 2. Now, as you mentioned, Josh Reynolds has the big game in this one. And occasionally you're going to be able to get people to fill in like that. But the Houston Texans now have the 3. And to have those pieces around the QB, and the other big difference there is that, Shawn McVay is so clearly the innovator and the guy who's making all of this work, even though Jared Goff, one of the things that has become pretty clear with his success with the Detroit Lions is that more of that was on him than people really wanted to give him credit for. You don't go and do what he did with the Rams and then go do what he's done with the Lions and not actually be well above average yourself, even though he does have some straightforward weaknesses that when they come out, people are like, well, no, we don't like that about him. He's not an MVP. He's not ever going to be in the GOAT conversation, obviously, but he is good. But you look at Sean McVay and what he was doing with the offense, it seems mostly on him. Houston obviously has good coaching as well. Some of the hires that they made, in contrast with other teams that blew up last season, those hires went very well. But for the Texans, it does seem like it's CJ Stroud. Jared Goff comes out there as a rookie pre-McVay and looks very overmatched. CJ Stroud comes out as a rookie and looks like an MVP candidate. So there are apples and oranges elements, but one of the things that I love about what Houston has done is they have added this Diggs piece. One of the things I think you have to question about the Rams as they try and get up there and compete with the 49ers for supremacy in the NFC West, which obviously is their goal. I mean, this is a team that has won a Super Bowl and made a second Super Bowl recently. You could argue has been, more successful at that very high end, even than the 49ers. We look at the fantasy pricing and we're thinking, can Cooper Kupp get enough volume with Puka Nacua being there, being a first round pick? And in reality, at least one of the relevant questions, it may not turn out to be the definitive question in any way, shape, or form, but like, where are they going to get the rest of the production? Because you see in a season like this that having the 3 matters. They do have the massive game here against the Chiefs, but as they then go down the stretch, the loss of Cooper Kupp turned out to be a pretty big deal.
Yeah, they're able to briefly make things still sing without Kupp here, but it gets a little tough down the stretch. Vic Fangio and Jim Schwartz put the Rams offense in a blender during the fantasy playoffs. And let's say at CJ Anderson, week 16, the Rams offense doesn't help you in that period. They do play at home here at Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. No SoFi yet. It was supposed to be in Mexico, but extreme weather created bad field conditions. So we're bringing it back to our temporary home of the USC Trojan. The same field where the Rams were stifled in the wild card by defending NFC champ Atlanta the previous year. It was a struggle on O outside of Kupp, really. They do add Brandon Cooks in the offseason, but how reticent are you to buy breakout offenses in year 2 when they're now priced up in fantasy, and how much is regression lurking in the background for you?
Well, I think that you have to look at the situations and try and determine what elements are really driving it. And so in some ways, I'm a little bit more concerned about coaching being definitive than players. Because one of the things that we have watched with the Kansas City Chiefs is that this game is so startling when you go back and watch it, because it's so completely different how they're attacking now than how they're attacking in 2023. You can go through and look at the charts, the tables, what have you, of all the different stats and how Mahomes, ADOT, and most of the other statistics are cratering each season, continuing to decline. And yet, because you have him, and then in addition, you have the coach, they're able to make the necessary adjustments. And not every season is huge from a fantasy football perspective. This most recent season was really more or less a disaster. After the 2022 campaign, in which they also win the Super Bowl, they thrive without Tyreek Hill after they make that trade. But this is one of the reasons why I wanted to examine some of the contrasts between, say, the Texans now, this Rams team back then, and the Rams team now, for example, where the number of different weapons that you have and whether or not the quarterback is the driver of the success. If you have to work around the QB, which is certainly what Sean McVay, there's probably no need to say insinuate. I mean, basically they come out and say in a variety of different ways, and with the trade for Matthew Stafford, and then with Matthew Stafford, they're able to take that next step. Anytime that you're having to scheme around the quarterback, I do think that there are going to be opportunities for teams to make adjustments. And you see that a little bit with the Miami Dolphins as well, where Tua is so perfect for what they do. And yet he has limitations that teams can occasionally attack. You have the success that they had in 2022, and then some mid to late season adjustments by defenses. Some of those adjustments are things that everyone is trying to incorporate. It's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to score in 2023. Some of those things are specific to them. Some of those things are simply successful in part because Tua is not the same guy. He's dealt with these injuries and they're having to start backups. Even then, the Dolphins coaching staff is so dynamic that they're able to work around a lot of those things, and they almost spring an upset in the playoffs. You come to 2023 and you have these massive early games, including this 70-point outburst against the Denver Broncos. And you can see how, again, the coaching is making the difference, but the QB, one of the biggest disappointments for 2023, at least for me, where I had a lot of Tua, he was not actually a big fantasy scorer. Now, part of that was that the running backs were simply so successful and so many long touchdowns that you get a lot of that sort of vultured by other players within the offense. But there's also this element where Hill and Waddle, and especially with Waddle not being healthy at the very end, and with Hill and Waddle having slightly lower route percentages in some context, that you don't have those secondary places you can go. So when we're looking at a coach-driven situation, I think we want to be looking at how we can inexpensively get pieces of that. And that was one of the things that really jumped out last year, where Mostert and Achane, certainly Kyron Williams, those guys benefit from the coaching genius that, it can be the Shanahan tree or it can be a variety of different trees, obviously, but mostly coming out of that same type of play calling and scheme dynamic. The cheaper guys really pay off for you. Some of the guys that you had to pay up for, maybe not as well. It's always going to come down to the talent of the individual player, though. In a Tyreek Hill, as long as he stays healthy, it's going to be very difficult for him to not smash. And I think that we want to always continue to balance those things. Is the player a superstar? You can pay up for that. Is the player inexpensive and has scenarios where if they hit because of this offensive context, then you have a league winner, versus players who are not superstars but are priced up because of the offense. It doesn't mean that won't work also, but I think we just have to be a lot more careful of those types of plays.
Chiefs answer by the end of quarter one with a 25-yard touchdown to Tyreek Hill. A bit underthrown, but he's open by like 5 steps, so it doesn't matter. Heading into, in the 2018 offseason, knowing you're going from Alex Smith to Patrick Mahomes and seeing the ADPs where Hill's going at borderline wide receiver 1. I think ADP had him around wide receiver 10. Mahomes is around quarterback 16. Kareem Hunt is around running back 10. Kelce is behind Gronk. Hunt gets injured, but Kelce and Hill end up number 1 by a mile in scoring. What was your view going into the offseason about a potential Mahomes production bump and the concentration of targets there? And what did you take going out of this season with the way things developed?
This kind of offense to me is perfect because you have the 2 superstars who are going to make it difficult for the defense to take the other guy away. And yet they're not going to lose much volume to other players. Now, in this game, Chris Conley does some nice things, but basically they don't have a third target. And so that is perfect. And one of the things that I think Ben and I talked about recently on one of our Stealing Bananas drafts, but it may have been the draft that Blair and I did for the RotoViz Best Ball show the other day. This element where if you get both Harrison and McBride, I like that a lot. I think that as opposed to hurting each other from a target perspective, the fact that they don't really have other players in that offense. Now, Zay Jones, I mean, he's more athletic than people realize. He's been a little bit more productive than people realize. But, I mean, probably not a guy who's going to come in and actually shift the target outlook for them. The second-year player, Wilson, he's one of those guys who was bid up a little bit last year because they don't have anybody else, not really a great prospect. Now, he does score some touchdowns, and so I think you have to be aware of the fact that if this offense really takes off and if he makes a jump, maybe you do get some incursion, especially in the red zone from him. But you're talking about Trey McBride, Marvin Harrison could absolutely explode together, and that's one of the things that we saw here. It's also the case that if you can get the big play, then everything changes. You look at this drive. So you start out this game early with the 2 Rams touchdowns and that Chiefs punt sandwiched in, I believe, after a drop from Travis Kelce. And I mean, you're down so far early. One of the things that also happened in the first half of this game is the Chiefs commit an avalanche of penalties. At one time, I think with still plenty of time left in the first half, they had 9 penalties. They finished the game with 13 for 135. Despite all of that, they're able to stay in the game because you can just score so quickly. In this particular possession that you just referenced, you have a short pass to Kelce, but then a 27-yard gain from Kareem Hunt. Again, that explosiveness at the running back position is a huge deal. One of the things that you look at from the Kansas City Chiefs last year, for example, is that they were number 1 in the NFL in yards before contact, and yet the running game was still just mediocre, right? And there are a variety of reasons that. Interior blocking, pretty solid, obviously scheme good. The fact that the Chiefs have one of the highest pass rates over expectation means the defense is obviously expecting you to throw the ball, and you're playing against almost exclusively pass defenses, and yet Pacheco and the rest of the guys, they have successful plays, but they don't create these big plays, and it has contributed to this element in recent years where the Chiefs have to run so many plays to score. Whereas you think back just a couple of seasons and you think back to one of my other favorite games that, we could do at some point is the playoff game where they immediately get down by 24 points or whatever it was to the Houston Texans. And you're ahead or tied by halftime, right? You think about how many possessions you would have to have it would take the entire game just from a possession perspective to come back in 2023 because you're moving the ball so slowly. You get that 27-yard game from Kareem Hunt. You get a 20-yard pass to Tyreek Hill, and then you follow it up with the 25-yard touchdown. The quick strike puts you right back in it, puts the pressure back on the other team. And I think that just dovetails very nicely with what you're hearing coming out of OTAs, where the emphasis supposedly, obviously a lot of this is just narrative and puff pieces and people enjoying the offseason and the fact that, guys are out there running around on the football field. But the idea is that Kansas City is going to attack you over the top again in 2024. You look at where they were last year, really their first bad offensive season with Reid and Mahomes together. And by bad, they're in the middle of the pack. They don't have the same point differential in 2023 that they have had previously. Now, by the end of the year, and as you go into the playoffs, they were clearly the best team in the NFL at that juncture, but they're not going to be satisfied with that in 2024. You have Xavier Worthy, you have Marquise Brown. They're going to throw the ball vertically. That's going to completely change what teams have to do against them and what they can do in terms of their entire strategy for the season, but also their tactics in any given possession.
Yeah, when you have to cross the street more times to get to the end zone, a lot more can go wrong. And they didn't have to cross it that many times in this game when they weren't, getting strip sacked by Aaron Donald, just playing at perhaps the peak defensive football performance in NFL history there in 2018. He gets Mahomes on either side of the half and results in one of Samson Ebukem's 2 defensive touchdowns. Kareem Hunt also, but they do take a mid-second quarter lead, 17-16, before a lot of that happens with a screen pass for 21 yards. As you mentioned, explosive plays they got out of the running back position looked much different back then. At 23-23 at the half, plenty more scoring left to be done. Did it seem like scoring would continue to just rise, jump from like 21.7 per game league-wide in 2017 to 23.3 and 18, cresting with the COVID year, 24.8 per game. Now we're coming off 2 straight years under 22. As that mark for the first time since 2006, 2007, we've been under 22 per game consecutive years. Did it seem like something would eventually give?
I don't know. I mean, I'm a fan of offense and I'm an optimist. So I wouldn't necessarily predict that you have to go the other direction. But we definitely saw with the COVID year that defenses were on the back foot. And if you don't have the crowd and both offenses are operating in an environment where they can communicate, then you're going to have some scoring. And so Ben and I have done so many shows over the last 2 years on Stealing Bananas. I encourage anybody who's interested to check those out on a lot of the trends within reality football and how the game is played, what the tactics are that have contributed to this decline in scoring. I do think that there is reason for optimism if you like points, in that very clearly some of the things that Ben Johnson and the Lions are doing, and in part that's coming back around to offensive talent. Certainly some of the things that Andy Reid and the Chiefs are doing. And then you look at this entire landscape now that is being populated by Shanahan and McVay related coaches. I think that you're going to have a way to attack these defenses and score points. And part of that is based on overcoming the defense's ability to stop explosives. So, right now we're in this mindset or dynamic where the defense understands the offense's incentives better and is better positioned to stop them, which is that you want to completely wipe away explosives, and then you want to create third downs where you can get stops. And maybe that has always been obvious, or should have always been obvious. Certainly, there were a lot of us who were arguing against the way that teams played offense from a running the ball perspective, the way they played defense in terms of emphasizing stopping plays that actually had very little value and you wanted to incentivize as opposed to stop. Once you've made some of those switches and you just continue to evolve tactically, it's not just the strategy of, okay, well, let's stop explosives and let's try and create third downs and then get stops. It's also, what are the specific schematic things that you have to do with your 11 guys in a football game to stop how offenses are now attacking you. And then that battle back and forth last year, especially with some of the motion that offense introduced to continually, not necessarily even stay ahead, but to try and keep pace and to move back in the right direction. Those things were fascinating. I think that we're going to get a combination of that, and then so many of these elite teams emphasizing total talent and then emphasizing explosive talent. You see the Chiefs and some similar teams adding speed. You're going to get teams that can emulate a lot of what the Dolphins have done, but perhaps with even better quarterback play. And then suddenly, those teams are going to score points. But what happened, and one of the things that or at least part of what's happened, is you continually get the offense to also understand and respect the value of not having these hugely negative plays. And that sometimes ends up making you too conservative. You mentioned what happens in sort of the closing minutes of the first half of this game, and it's absolutely insane that you have a situation where the Chiefs get a strip sack and are then able to, on the very next play, have that 21-yard Kareem Hunt score. They force a punt, but then the Rams get a strip sack and a scoop and score on that play as the Chiefs are trying to score under 2 minutes. And then the Chiefs immediately come back and are able to score under 2 minutes. But then they come back out and they have an additional defensive touchdown scored against them there. And the thing that really jumped out in this game to me that was just so stunning beyond how much fun Tyreek Hill was and what a loss it is to the Chiefs, and beyond Kareem Hunt no longer being there. And obviously there are reasons that he left the Chiefs, and I think they had to make those choices. My concern is mostly their weird decisions at running back since then. But Patrick Mahomes in this game, they score 51 points, and yet he was a completely different player. His pocket presence now, he may go the entire rest of his career and not have a couple of plays where he gets sacked, loses a sense of where those rushers are. He may go the rest of his career and not have two more plays like that. And partly, as you mentioned, it's about Aaron Donald. Obviously, you have the Super Bowl a couple years later where all of their offensive line is injured and they have trouble with that. But his ability to defeat pressure, and you think about this most recent season where the interior offensive line is elite, but the tackles are probably pretty poor. His ability to neutralize the rush, to get into the right spot, to either run himself or extend plays and then get those things. If you needed to replay this game now and everything else being the same except for his pocket awareness, the Chiefs would have scored 70. So that was the thing that really jumps out to you. Like, he didn't have that understanding that he does today.
Felt like he was going to score 70. Things like you mentioned held him back. There is a Tyreek back there somewhere throw late in the game that ends up in a turnover, similar to what you see him going at Antoine Winfield in the Super Bowl and in a couple other spots earlier in his career. Here, they go down 40-30, largely keyed by the Rams' defense creating turnovers. Wade Phillips, number 2 unit, but different period for defenses, not limiting the big play as much, and somehow you get Tyreek Hill, and Tyreek Hill is open by a good 30 yards. Shields eats the dirt as Hill cuts up field, gets the Chiefs right back in it, 40-37. On the sideline, Eric Bieniemy is saying, like, the quote is, hey, I don't know what they did, why they called it, don't give a fuck, we'll do it again. We'll see both teams get into the 50s here. Great roster to have, especially have some players to supplant the Rams down the stretch. And I was listening to the RotoViz Best Ball show while you and Larry Andrews were talking about building a super team while having fun. Encourage folks to check out RotoViz tools to deconstruct market inefficiencies while putting their own spin on drafting philosophy. Great research pieces with forward-looking advice also at rotoviz.com with a sub there. And to coach you along, sub-follow RotoViz Radio podcast feed where you can get this show streaming in parallel to our Remember That Game feed, and also shows like Stealing Bananas and the RotoViz Best Ball show. How fun was it to have Chiefs to root for, both in fantasy and reality in 2018?
Yeah, this would be one of those seasons for the ages. And you mentioned that long score that it's almost impossible to believe that the Chiefs could have put up 51 points in a game where they committed all those penalties that I mentioned earlier, and they had all of those mistakes and the turnovers. And one of the things that was always kind of funny when you go back and look at Mike Martz's career is that his teams committed a bunch of turnovers, but his record with a negative turnover margin was not as good as when it was positive, but compared to historical averages and everybody else were absolutely crazy. They have that situation where they have the fumble and the Rams go down and score to go up 30-23. The Chiefs immediately go back and make it 30-all. You get the Rams field goal, and then you get this play in there. And I wanted to ask what you thought of this one, because in addition to these two strip sacks, you also have a pick six that Patrick Mahomes throws. And it was kind of one of these weird bad plays where his feet get stuck and the underneath element of the play where you've got a blocker and a defender tied up, and then his target is immediately beyond that. And because of the weird way that his feet get stuck and his hips don't really turn, he massively underthrows it. And so these guys who shouldn't have been in the way end up being in the path of the ball. And the defender, Samson Ebukam, there makes one of the most extraordinary interceptions ever, because he essentially reaches his hand out and deflects it a little bit off of the blocker. And then the pass was not thrown to him, right? For a defensive player to make that play, to then take it back to score the touchdown, to put him up 40-30, that was astonishing. Then you get the back-to-back quick punts that don't take time off the clock. And then, as you mentioned, you get this 73-yard touchdown that makes it 40-37. And at that point, the Chiefs have committed all of those penalties. They've had 3 offensive plays that either were a pick six, a scoop and score, or a play that directly led very quickly afterward to a Rams score. And they're right in the game. They're down by 3 points.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hey, it's Kaylee Cuoco for Priceline. Ready to go to your happy place for a happy price? Well, why didn't you say so? Just download the Priceline app right now and save up to 60% on hotels. So whether it's Cousin Kevin's Kazoo Concert in Kansas City, go Kevin, or Becky's Bachelorette Bash in Bermuda, you never have to miss a trip ever again. So download the Priceline app today. Your savings are waiting.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
Mahomes, first year as a starter, got locked into the play as designed, and they'd had a bunch of designs like that early in the game where very creatively clear out the short middle part of the field, and on a key 4th and 2, they do that as well. And then just Travis Kelce's just wide open, and it's just Andy Reid absolutely cooking. And this scenario, it just wasn't there. 2023 Mahomes, this is a bust. I'm going to find something else. Isn't a turnover or a negative play here, but first year Mahomes, I imagine it is more locked into the design first read, which had been, but not there. And yeah, Ebukam takes it back. First player in NFL history with 2 touchdowns, a sack, and an interception in the same game. It would be a career high 5 turnovers for Pat Mahomes. I don't think he'd even have more than 3 again the rest of his career. This Reid offense was more aggressive than 2023. That Martz offense you mentioned, extremely aggressive, probably more similar in aggression than to this Chiefs offense than the Chiefs offense last season. If folks want to check out a few episodes ago on this show, season 2, episode 19, we had Mike Martz's Rams against the Carolina Panthers in the 2003 divisional. At some point after the show, we had Stephen Reese from the Ringer on, and we're chatting about this game, in fact, and how Reid and McVay, they reinvent themselves in a way that flip this idea to you. McVay is Shanahan tree, but it's all, they both have connections like Bill Walsh tree, but the way these two guys have reinvented the entire offense at different points in their career to have resurgences. Do you get younger Andy Reid vibes at all from Sean McVay?
I think that is possible. Obviously, they do plenty of things differently, but what you're seeing from the successful offensive coaches is that they're willing to take pieces from other offenses and game plans that are successful and that specifically address tactical needs at the time. They're not saying, okay, this is what worked previously, and this is our offense, and this is how we beat what the defense is doing to us, if it's no longer the best way to beat it. And so when you have coaches like Shanahan, McVay, McDaniel, Andy Reid, those minds are continuing to both innovate and steal, right? And so one of the things about that is that sometimes it can be very easy to copy and successfully do things that other people are doing. And sometimes it can be very easy to take what you do well and continue to make it better. But there's a reluctance to do the other thing, either because you're like, well, somebody else thought of that, I don't want to do it. Obviously, you have that in fantasy football, where if there are innovations that come from someone that maybe you're not as big a fan of, or just didn't come from you or someone at your site, you can be reluctant to use those things. Whereas the things that you do well, maybe you continue to make them better and better. And the opposite is sometimes true as well. You do obviously have some people who are going to feel a lot better, more or less copying the good things that other people do. And that can be very successful. Ideally, you do both, right? You have the confidence in what you do well and your own ability to continue to think and to create and to address new problems or new opportunities that arise. And you simultaneously don't ignore or avoid the things that other people have highlighted that can allow you to be successful. You put all of those things together and you're the best person at your job. I think that group does that really well. Whereas you see, I mean, one of the teams that was hugely disappointing last season was the Jacksonville Jaguars and Doug Peterson. And you get this environment, well, it's like, yeah, it's no longer Urban Meyer. We can be thankful for that. But simply having a coach who rescued you from a disastrous situation, having a coach who also has those Super Bowl credentials, if that person is no longer innovating and or even just successfully copying the innovations that work in the present, that's a huge problem for you. And so, yeah, I think that the things that the Rams have done, because certainly they're not beating defenses the same way in 2023 with Puka Nacua. They weren't beating defenses in the same way in 2021 and 2022 with the Cooper Kupp eruption that they were beating them with in 2018, when you have this slightly more balanced attack and you have Todd Gurley and you have Jared Goff. I love the coaching staffs that are able to do both of those things that I mentioned, but then also play to the strengths of their players and amplify those, mitigate the weaknesses, as opposed to the offenses, where certainly anytime that you have guys who are well above average players, I mean, I think it's tempting to throw the word star around because these guys are so good. If you're an above average player at the NFL level, I mean, you're one of the best players in the world. You are a star. But you think about one of the things that I pointed out last season as being a little bit of a red flag for me with Travis Etienne, for example, was that this is a guy who was a collegiate star. This was a guy who, once he got healthy at the NFL level, looked very, very good. This is a player where you could objectively look at the charting numbers and see that his ability to hit the hole, to pick the right hole, to follow the game plan was well above average. I mean, Sports Info Solutions numbers showed that his percentage of hitting the design gap was extremely high. And the rhetoric that the Jaguars are throwing out there in the offseason is that that's like the main way this guy can get better. Like, that's a weird disconnect. And that is discouraging for me, because that is not the narrative that a team that amplifies the strengths of their stars is going to be putting out there.
Yeah, Todd Gurley, RB1 with a bullet this season in fantasy. In 2021, when they win the title, we're talking Sony, Michelle, post-Patriots, Darrell Henderson, and then Cam Akers trying to make it back from an injury, not being quite the same, and McVay adapting. In 2018, it was largely a question whether he had that reinvention gear. Goff does have some struggles in the middle parts of the game. He does lead 2 big touchdown drives down the stretch as we get down to the final stanza where Mahomes has a chance to answer. But coming out of this week, there's still a little bit of time in the fantasy season since it's pre-Thanksgiving, and most leagues will still at least have a few days to make a trade. Coming off of this performance, but with Cooper Kupp gone, were you looking to sell or hold in this situation? And what's your general ethos as far as like making deals before the deadline based on offenses that, you know, maybe suffer a major injury that could have reverberating effects?
I don't know that it would have been that obvious that Cooper Kupp was the guy at that point. And certainly when you're having Josh Reynolds play a strong game like he did here, we've got a great streaming tool on the site, and I encourage people to use that information to help them make some trades that are going to be very, very valuable to them every single season. We see guys who have been struggling because they're sort of these volume guys. They're these plotters, and the schedule has been neutral or bad, and the efficiency is awful. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is that you should chase efficiency. You should want talented players. If you're drafting a full team of players based on a volume thesis, you're probably not going to have enough upside. But when you're making these trades before the deadline, if you've got someone who has demonstrated now through the season that they have this locked in volume, and suddenly their schedule is going to take this massive turn for the better, the deals that you can get there in many cases are going to be very, very good. So I think that you want to make some moves. At the same time, I probably wouldn't be selling these guys for the reason that, I mean, predicting the future is always difficult, but certainly predicting very specific things like an offense is going to go through a downturn at this moment that's going to cause a problem. One of the things about having the elite coaching is that you have the ability to overcome adjustments that teams make against you. So the Rams struggle a little bit more down the stretch. They have the very frustrating / embarrassing Super Bowl loss to the Patriots, but they do come back and play well. A few years later, they win a Super Bowl, and in part because of those things that you mentioned about McVay. I don't know that we would necessarily have said at the time, oh, this is going to be a guy who can make those moves. But one of the things that we have fairly consistently seen from that style of coach, and again, some of this now is just retrospective, but that those coaches have been good at adjusting to the way that defenses adjust to them. And they know that they're going to have to, because they're so innovative that their moves do then catalyze defensive changes. You simply have to change to take away some of the things that they do. They are going to have, though, the next answer. And so I don't think you want to move off of players on teams where the coach is going to have the answer, because you don't know like when those adjustments are going to happen. If you think that you can predict that, then there are probably more successful ways for you to use your fortune-telling abilities than playing fantasy football. And, you know, you look at this particular game, for example, and I mean, the back and forth is so much fun, because after the Chiefs score that 73-yard touchdown, then they are the beneficiaries of a strip sack and a fumble return by Allen Bailey there. And suddenly you're up 44-40, right? And it's interesting because the 3 sacks that Patrick Mahomes take in this game stand out as such a sore thumb kind of moment, because they completely change everything about the game. And yet Goff actually took the 5 sacks. He took more sacks in this game. He takes a devastating sack at this point in time. But the interesting thing about it is that, I mean, 6 plays, 75 yards, a minute and a half, they're back ahead because of the big strike ability. They have 27-yard pass to Josh Reynolds. You mentioned how well he played in this game. The 36-yard play to Robert Woods. Watching this game, too, for me was kind of fun, because even knowing that he had this stretch where he was equivalent to or better than Cooper Kupp, you don't think of him as a dynamic player. We know they did all of these little handoffs to him. He would get the end around types of plays. But the 36-yard gain there is very difference making in this game. Shifts everything around. Then Gerald Everett, who obviously, you know, becomes a little bit more of a punchline as his career goes on. He scores to put him up 47-44. And that's kind of the moment where you're thinking, okay, as a Chiefs fan, a little bit of the here we go again type of vibe, although this particular game is certainly in no way, shape, or form a must win. But the other thing that jumps out so much here is just that they are still in the throes of a long stretch of defensive weakness. Now, 2014, 2015, the defense was actually pretty strong, but and those seasons are under Reid. But you're thinking back to the Dick Vermeil era where they put up so many points, but the defense was so catastrophically bad that it doesn't necessarily matter. This season here for Kansas City, they're coming off a year where they were 24th in yards, and then a year where they're 28th in yards. Both of those seasons, they were better from a scoring defensive perspective. And so you can say, well, you know, maybe they were doing some things tactically that allowed them to give up yards but not points. That wasn't true in 2018, where they're 31st in yards but 24th in points. On offense, they're number 1 in both categories, not surprisingly. I mean, they put up 565 points this season. But when you go, I mean, Even 12-4, when you put up 565 points, is sort of a funny outcome. This 31st ranking in yards is very clear as you're watching the end of this game, where they have no answers for the Rams. And again, it's just so striking when you think about how football has been played the last several years, that these defenses are letting wide receivers run free 20 yards down the field. Like, no defensive back in sight.
Still does today. Ben Johnson creating this to some effect, but it seemed like on just like a whole other level this game, where Jared Goff sticks the ball into Todd Gurley's belly, pulls it out, turns, and fires up the seam. I think it was like 18 for 19 on seam throws this game, something ridiculous. But then on some of the second reaction stuff, as you mentioned, the 5 sacks, even given all that, Jared Goff's receivers really outperformed ADP. Kupp, his per game pace would have made him like a wide receiver 1. Robert Woods, as you mentioned, rewatching him, he looks, you just forget, he's a good player. He finished as a low end wide receiver 1 as well. Tyreek Hill entered the season as around wide receiver 10, but it was somewhat of an efficient market. You had Antonio Brown, DeAndre Hopkins, Odell Beckham, who decent per game average, Julio, Michael Thomas, Devontae Adams. I don't know if there's anything egregious here. Keenan Allen did play every game that season, but with like 50% less points per game than Tyreek Hill. AJ Green and Mike Evans round out the top 10. Is there anything that egregious looking back as far as like not having any Rams in the top 10 and Tyreek Hill, it was ADP so low in the top 10?
I don't necessarily think so. The natural expectation would be for the Rams targets to be split. And even in this game, you get the 12 targets for Brandon Cooks. We haven't talked about him a lot, but he does go 8 for 107. You get the 11 targets for Woods, only catches 4 of those, but goes for 72 yards and a touchdown. Josh Reynolds gets 8 targets, 6 for 80 and 1. Gerald Everett actually gets the 2 scores in this game, but Higbee is the person who has almost twice as many targets. The fun thing in this one is just with the shootout, you get 46 targets on the Rams side. You get 46 targets on the Chiefs side. Hill and Kelce, 29 of those 46 targets. This is a game where Patrick Mahomes threw 46 times and averaged over 10 yards per attempt. Gets up to 478 yards, 6 touchdowns. Obviously, he throws those 2 late interceptions when it's emergency time. And one of the things that's kind of fun too is just seeing him throw those picks. I mean, you almost feel like QBs would not try and win the game now in order to protect their stats, because if you throw picks, everybody's going to be out there shouting about how you're not good at avoiding the throws. I mean, the stats are we're so saturated with all of these things, and you're going to have people saying, okay, well, this was a turnover worthy throw that you had here and here and here. It's like, well, did it happen under 2 minutes left when, you're at 3rd and 15 or something like that? Or did it happen when you were up 21-17 and driving to put the game away? They're very different situations there. I love to see the aggressiveness. We get 10 combined passing touchdowns in this game. It was interesting because as the game progresses, you get a few more of those Rams penalties to balance out some of the dynamic we got in the first half there with the Chiefs. But even where we are now, where both teams are in the 40s, things aren't over yet.
I like to think that check down to Hawkinson was a seminal moment in Kirk's career. Because it seemed like it's like the following year, he's like, no, I'm going at the sticks. And with Mahomes, it's from the get-go, if we have a chance to strike downfield and win now, I'm going to try to do it. Unfortunately, they maybe score a little too quick on that drive. When they take the lead, 51-47, Rams go down, score. Goff with a dime down the sideline to Gerald Everett, Patrick Mahomes. There's the downside of a first-year starting quarterback, as you mentioned, the 2 picks, and they both look really bad at the catch point, where there's like no one but a Ram within like 5-10 yards. The first one he was hit, I feel like Mahomes today has a better feel for if he was about to get rocked as he's trying to throw it downfield. The second one, it was kind of like a Tyreek back there somewhere. It only traveled about 50 yards in air. I feel like he can throw farther than that, but Aaron Donald bearing down, flashing to his vision, 2 fumbles lost into the game, and you see Donald again. I could see how that could affect the throw. And that final interception makes it a 54-41 game. Were you, as a Chiefs fan coming out of that, scored 51 points, are pretty bullish, but were there some things you took away about how ready this Chiefs team was? And then the way the season ends against the Patriots, view going into that as, hey, this is right at the start, house money, or was it more like terrified of losing as favorites against a Patriots team that seemed like it was on the tail end?
Yeah, it seemed like a huge missed opportunity, and you hate the way that the overtime played out there, although the Chiefs have also been the beneficiaries of how the overtime rules have worked in the different seasons. I think that in terms of exercising the demons, to come out against the Colts, which is a team that they had lost to at home in some huge situations in the past, and absolutely destroy them, especially coming off of an end to the season where you lose 2 out of 3 to finish. But you hammer the Colts, and then you play so well against the Patriots. You certainly feel like you're the better team, but maybe you're a year away in terms of having the defense to fully complement that offense. I mean, you were expecting the other team to score. Even after that Rams game, you have a victory against the Raiders where you give up 33. You have a victory against the Ravens where you give up 24. You lose to the Chargers 29-28. You lose to the Seahawks 38-31. I mean, your defense is used to getting absolutely scorched. So when you give up 37 in overtime to Tom Brady and the Patriots, that's not surprising. I think that there's plenty of optimism at that point, especially when it's this combination of Mahomes and Andy Reid, and then you have the peripheral talent around him at that point too. And one of the things that's been so interesting is that they've, won these back-to-back Super Bowls really with a lot less offensive skill position talent. But I think, it would be absurd at that point, even with how good Mahomes was. I mean, this is one of the greatest seasons of all time. He comes out in his first real season as a starter with a 5,050 season. I mean, it's a 5,050 season in a 16-game year, right? He already looks like he's going to be one of the greatest of all time, and you expect maturation from him that helps balance some of the things that opposing teams do to adjust, because you're not going to run that hot every year, and you're also going to get very specific things to take you away. And so you know that the 5,050 is not going to happen every season, and when you don't, make it to the Super Bowl when you have that, you're going to be frustrated in the same way that you think about, where the Buffalo Bills are with Josh Allen. Nothing is given to you. There's no guarantee that you're going to make it. You think about where the Bengals are with Joe Burrow, even though they make a Super Bowl, but they blow it. You think about where the Baltimore Ravens are with Lamar Jackson and how good they looked last year, right up until they crumble in the AFC Championship game. You even think about where the 49ers have been, where they don't have a Patrick Mahomes, but the overall roster is so dynamic, their ability to put up points and to also pressure you on defense, so crazy. The fact that you come back and you end up winning these 3 Super Bowls is absolutely fantastic, but you can't help but feel like it's a missed opportunity because you only get to play 1 year every 12 months, and the other teams are very, very good.
Call up Spags. Obviously, Steve Spagnuolo, hugely instrumental in helping the Chiefs get over the hump. Great for the Chiefs, but limiting in any way for the offense in fantasy.
I don't know that it is or that it should be. So much of what's happened is that you're losing possessional volume. And specifically in some of the games that they lost, they didn't put the other team away because they allowed the game to be shortened. Now, throughout the course of the entire season, you're going to see a little bit less of an effect, but when you pull out the specific losses, it's so clear that has happened. I don't think the Chiefs are sitting around by any stretch and being comfortable with where they are. You have the 2022 year where they're again first in yards and points, and to fall from that to 15th in points when you have Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid, that part is really pretty hard to handle if you're those guys. I mean, you're thinking about the last year that Alex Smith was there. You're 5th in yards, 6th in points, still even a lot better than what they did. And then obviously you go on this run where the lowest that they ranked in either yards or points from 2018 to 2022 was 6th, right? It's a huge drop off. The flip side of that is that, I mean, the Chiefs had actually been okay defensively. And you look at the last 5 years, they're in the top 10 in points allowed. But the yardage situation going into 2023 had not been particularly good. And then last year they had this big jump up in how well they defend from a yardage perspective, making them just utterly dominant. Then they finished near the top in points as well. You do lose Snead, and while he's probably not the driver of all of that, every piece on defense matters. The scheme is going to matter, and then how your players execute that, I mean, it makes a big difference. So you have Chris Jones. He's going to be there. He's going to be the driver of everything that they do, and yet injuries could potentially cause an issue there. But there's also a very clear desire to get back to dominating, to get back to being the number 1 seed, to get back to setting records, to get back to winning MVPs, to get back to building the legacies for these guys outside of just winning Super Bowls. Now, the Super Bowls are hugely important, but their philosophy on how you make 2024 work and how you accomplish this almost impossible three-peat is going to be to dominate on both sides of the ball, to be the number 1 team in yards, the number 1 team in points. I think you're going to see Kansas City put up 500 points in 2024, and that's obviously a huge challenge. 2022, they put up 496. So in a 17-game season is definitely very doable, but I mean, it's going to take Marquise Brown, it's going to take Xavier Worthy, and it's just going to take a much more aggressive mindset than they had last season.
This has been another episode of Remember That Game. Please rate, review, subscribe, and check out more episodes.